Concur.
Thank you. What's this book? And blow the dust off. And what do we have here?
In front of us. Well, we have no idea what this is. It's an old book, but we have no idea what it is. And so let's talk about what do we find? What do we notice? Well, we notice it's got different books inside of it. It's a book that has more books. Okay, how many of them? And we just talk through for an hour. What do we see? What do we find here? And that's kind of what Mackey's doing here. What is this? When we pick it up, what is this? We have, and I forgot to bring, I read a paragraph today for school next week that I was like, this is class tonight. But it just talks about we bring a lot of assumptions and intuitions as we walk into this book, okay, that we don't even know that we're bringing. They have a lot to do with our circumstances, our culture, our context, where we're coming from, our church life, our church history. We bring things that aren't there. And like human nature is, when we have something so ingrained in us, we can even look and read something and read it like we thought it said. Okay? Because we're reading what we believe into it. Okay? Mackey is asking us to say, time out, let's put that aside. Okay? Let's see if we can set down everything we know and let's take it. Let's listen to what's here. And I love the way he said it. He said, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, he used it like the phrase, stepping out of the line.
Yes.
Mona Lisa.
Yes.
To say, why am I here?
Yeah, what am I doing here?
What am I here to see?
Yeah. And he said, let's love these authors. Let's love our neighbor as ourselves, and hear what they have to say. So that was the kind of the first week. And the second week was, okay, we've got this quilt. Okay, he used the metaphor of a quilt. He's going to continue to use the metaphor of a quilt tonight, a little bit in the video. Okay, and this quilt is, well, what was the metaphor of the quilt? What was he trying to say? Yeah, there's pieces that are interconnected. Okay, they all have a story. A family quilt that people treasure may have been contributed. Somebody contributed this square, from their immediate family, and there's a piece from my grandmother's sweater, and there's a piece from my grandfather's army uniform, and there's a piece from my husband's father's, construction uniform, and it's all put in this square, and it's a family, then that's tied to the family next, to brother and sister, and perhaps that's what a quilt is. A quilt can be lots of things. And so he says this is kind of like the Bible. Okay, it's got interconnected stories. It's written over time. There's a story that it's trying to tell. Okay, and really and truly, Genesis 2 through 5 is a square that's sewn into a larger quilt. Okay, first of all, there's a quilt that's the old Hebrew Bible. Okay, for us, there's a quilt that's the Hebrew Bible and the early church writings. The records from the early church. The quilt's even bigger. But that was the point he was trying to make, and talking about situation and context. Let's listen in to the context instead of putting our own situation on this, and this means this. And he's going to do one more thing tonight with that's so important. I was just like, we can't pass that up. We can't pass this up. So he's going to take the quilt metaphor one step further. And that's what we're going to hear tonight. He closes with taking us to a verse. And if you want to go ahead and turn there and be ready when he gets there, because it's one of the most powerful descriptions. He asks the question, what are these scriptures? What are they for? Well, Paul tells us what they're for. 2 Timothy chapter 3, if you want to leave your Bible there, he'll be there a little bit later. Yeah, 2 Timothy chapter 3, beginning in verse 16, trying to see. Verse 16. Okay, so he'll end there. Let's see, I think I wrote down one other thing. I really think this has everything to do with what we just finished in Worldview and the mission of God, in that one of the calls of the mission of a church being recommitted to the mission of God is to change their thinking, because we really and truly have not been in a religion for the last few centuries that has really seriously considered the mission of God. Okay? And so what we're going to have to change is our mind. Okay, we're going to have to do some change in the way we think, and that's what Tim Mackey is saying here. And I've even heard him talk about connecting this to the mission of God. He does it in these videos. But think about, Jesus said, first commandment, most important, love the Lord with all your mind. Okay, so we're supposed to, commanded by Jesus, figure out what it means to love the Lord more deeply in our thought. That means who he is, and that means what he's like, and that means, now that's not all we're supposed to do, right? We're supposed to love him with our heart and our soul and everything in us. But he seems to always begin with the mind, okay? Then Paul comes along, and I think he maybe had Jesus' words in mind, and he goes, be transformed. He says, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, your bodies, your whole life, everything you got. Be transformed. Then he says, be transformed by the renewing of what? Where does it start? In your mind. Okay? So there seems to be this thing in the New Testament that says transformation's going to happen, new life's going to happen, and there's a lot of indications that it begins in the way we think, in the way we process things. And one of those things is approaching book with humility and understanding that people wrote in their context, okay? So just keep that in mind, and we'll talk a little bit after the video. Thank you. Thanks, Spencer and Mariah.
So here's the implication of the nature of the Hebrew Bible as a collection of collections. What it means is that there are many potential contexts for the Adam and Eve story. And kind of emerging the Mona Lisa parable now quote metaphor. The Adam and Eve story has been crafted intentionally as part of the introduction to the storyline of the Hebrew Bible. That as an entire work, I think it is doing exactly what Jesus said it's doing. It's pointing to the need of Israel and all humanity for some kind of deliverer figure who can do for Israel and for every human what we can't do for ourselves. I'm going to go with Jesus on that one. So when we're talking about what Genesis 2 through 5 means, that's what I mean. What it means is the introduction to this literary work. But the reason people are standing in line to look at the Adam and Eve story is usually for all kinds of other questions. Here's just three. People often are looking to these chapters to gain insight into human origins. Yeah? So here's the thing. You can do that. You can take Genesis 2 through 5 out of the book, and you can make it be part of a new quilt that's about human origins. But at least let's recognize that we're ripping this thing out of context when we do that. And all of a sudden, you're reading certain details, and what you're interpreting them with reference to a totally different quilt, different questions, different vocabulary, different. And so we just have to be aware of this. And we're all doing this all the time, but once you name it, I think you can start to become aware of it. The significance of Genesis 2 through 5 for understanding gender is huge. Reason why people are interested in the Adam and Eve story. But let's recognize that the story wasn't designed to illuminate that issue with this narrative. It just simply wasn't. There may be, well, the third one, original sin, maybe. It's the same, you kind of get the point that I'm making here. So I'm going to be making a distinction between the meaning of Genesis 2 through 5, and here I'm after what the people who framed the quilt meant me to understand by putting this as an introduction to the quilt. Now that doesn't mean Genesis 2 through 5 can't speak to other issues. I think that's what it means for the Bible to be the Bible, is that it shapes our perspective and gives us wisdom to think about any area in life. But I should at least be aware that what I'm doing is I'm creating a bridge between a meaning to address a topic that the biblical author just didn't have on their minds. I think the narrative can speak to it, but let's be really aware of what we're doing when we make it speak to it, and that we'll often be making imaginative leaps when we talk about the significance of it. Now that's not bad, but when we don't realize that's what we're doing, we're liable to really distort what the biblical authors were trying to do there. I could have just ended with that thought, but I think it helps to see how the Hebrew Bible was formed, to see that distinction, and it's been hugely helpful for me. Thoughts or reflections? Yeah.
So what is the significance of that on authority? Yeah.
I think I know what you mean.
Yep.
But to ask your question.
So if there's an intended meaning that we as the reader, whether we're original readers or modern readers,
Yeah.
are supposed to take, and that is the intention of the author,
Yeah.
I would definitely say that there's like an authoritative element to the text in that context. But what is the significance of the differentiation between meaning and significance for reading a text
Yeah.
out of context and thinking through the significance and the implications
Yep.
of
Yeah, that's right. Yes, what I've avoided is a really clunky word that biblical scholars and theologians love to use. It's called hermeneutics. That's because it's not even an English word, for goodness sakes. It's a Greek word spelled with English letters, which means to interpret or to translate. Actually, the most original meaning was to translate between one language and configuration of meaning and another. So, yeah, I think it's a really important question. What I first want to honor, as I love the biblical authors myself, what did they mean? So let's hear that. Now, if I could ask the biblical authors to write a different story that was a primer on gender theory, how would they do it? And I think it's crucial that we recognize we're doing something different than simply saying, God says X. What we're saying is, I think there is an important implication of what God said about X, and I'm going to infer from that an insight into B. But let's recognize that's my tradition, and me and my tradition doing that. And it seems to me this is this is how the apostles talked about the work of the Holy Spirit. When Jesus said the Spirit would come and he would give you new insight into the things that I've taught you. It's about context, isn't it? I don't live in ancient Jerusalem. I don't live among a community of messianic prophets waiting the Messiah in Jerusalem. But does that mean God has nothing to say to anybody who's not living in it? No, of course, he does. But it's going to be in partnership with what the meaning of the text is. And so I think it's attaching a different level of authority to our interpretive traditions. And it may be that the Spirit is leading, right, that connection so that God's people can gain new insight on whatever, sin, gender, culture, power, all this kind of thing. But it's different than saying this is thus saith the Lord. Yes. It's the dance that Jews and Christians have done with the Old and New Testaments for 2,000 years. So I could have been more concise in my response, but that's my first thought. I guess, yeah. Does anybody else have a thought on that or another reflection if not?
I have a question. I find myself, when I've read the Adam and Eve stories, I'm obviously the one that's taking this piece of the quilt and I'm gonna stitch it to this, whether it's geology or anthropology. But I'm just curious, why do you think, as Western readers, I don't want to generalize this all, but generally, why do you think we are so quick to go to Genesis 2 through 5 or 6 or whatever is about the anthropology of humanity and all that stuff? Why do you think we go there so quickly?
Man, that would be a whole course. It would be a whole course.
That's a dense question.
Yeah, it is. Essentially, how I understand it, the way that European and American culture have gone in parallelism is being birthed out of the Jewish Christian worldview. And the rise of the modern nation state in the 16 to 17, 1800s, essentially it was all built on a rival worldview to the biblical one that was claiming a different level of divine authority. And so what you have is rival narratives emerging about who we are, where we came from, why we're all here, and what we should be doing. And so because something as important as the beginning of the biblical story is the foundation of the Christian narrative, It's the first place where there's going to be conflict with an alternate narrative of human origins, of human purpose, and so on. So really, it's a clash between views of the meaning of life, but these chapters have become the fault line of many of those debates. And so I'm actually not a historian, but another way to say it would be the people who come out of cultures that were birthed in Europe, in the Enlightenment and the late Middle Ages, are obsessed with questions of process, of thinking that the meaning of something is grasped when you break it down to its fundamental parts, and you understand the parts and how it works, therefore I understand its meaning. So human origins, okay, let's talk about that. So you get an alternate narrative about human origins, and then it's in some kind of conflict with this account, and then culture wars begin. So it's usually larger cultural forces at work, just like in the Mona Lisa line. It's some other thing that's attracting people to the Mona Lisa. And unfortunately, the actual Mona Lisa gets lost in the shuffle. Yeah. That's a great question. Yes, we could spend a long time talking about that. What do you have any thoughts as you've thought about the question?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but for me, I feel myself personally wanting just to know why. Like, where did we come from? Is this literal? Is this, okay, if it's not, then like, what does that mean? Because it impacts like how I teach this, but also just like my understanding of my humanity. Like, where does this all come from?
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah, I don't know, man. Like, I just, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, okay, all right. So I make it so complicated. Let's just make it more simple. One of the fundamental questions of human identity is, who am I? Where am I? Where did I come from? And where am I going? And everybody has worked out a way and lives out of a value set that answers those questions. We're usually not even aware of how we've answered them already, but our lifestyle shows that we've made some kind of choice about those questions. And so those are important questions. Those are they're not exactly, they are some of the questions that this narrative is answering in a really unique way. We can all sense that that's what these narratives are about in some way. The question is, how are they addressing those questions? And are they doing it in the language and imagery and vocabulary that my culture has taught me to think about those questions? And what if they're really different languages? So how do we navigate that difference between the significance of these narratives for human origins versus their meaning? So I'm with you. I want to get it right too. I think that's why I've been so obsessed with these pages of the Bible for decades now, so I'm just going to invite you into that. Yeah.
Well, I'm along for the ride.
Yeah, you and me both. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
So I think we're of course modern, so we think about how we take parts of the quilt and bring it into our own ideas or quilts or stories. I guess there's also this reverse process, right? Because these pieces of the quilt were potentially taken from other quilts. Maybe they were done individually, or maybe they're taken from a larger quilt.
Yeah.
And so, within this kind of analogy, there's this idea that there are these other quilts, and it could have been other quilts that the family had made previously. It might have been another family made it. It might have been that there's like a picture that like a family member was looking at while they were sewing it together, and the family also had to buy string that might have influenced how it looks, and there's this kind of materialness of how it gets put together. So how much of that, like, is there a necessity, a benefit of trying to work back to where some of these pieces came from and understanding that other quilt? To be able to understand how the biblical authors were taking it and kind of doing this other process and why they were doing it, or what the dialogue or the reasons why they made certain choices. Is that necessary? Is that helpful? How do you navigate that in Israel's context and the context of other nations, of Babylon, of Samaria, to other places that might have influenced them? Like how important is that into understanding these in the way that the biblical authors would have done.
Man, that's a great question. In many ways, the history of biblical scholarship over the last 200 years has been, for the most part, an effort to reverse engineer the quilt, to take it apart, and then reconstruct what the quilt pieces meant before they were incorporated into the quilt. And there are some parts of the Bible where you can actually do that with a little more degree of probability than others. This class isn't about the flood narrative, but when we do get to that part of Genesis, that's a large part of what we'll do, because you can actually make out the quilt piece that has been put into the book of Genesis, because it looks a lot like quilt pieces that exist from ancient Sumerian Babylon. It's so cool. There are some similar dynamics happening with the Adam and Eve story, and I'll point those out along the way. But for the most part, I want to acknowledge that those previous contexts of the material of the Hebrew Bible exists, but that they don't determine the meaning of it in the form that the quilt is right now. The form that we have is more or less the form that Jesus read, and that's the Bible that I want to read and understand. As a historian, I'm very interested in what the quilt looked like before it was put together in its different pieces. But that's a different question than asking, what does it mean in this form? So one big piece, and this will be kind of as we kind of pause and begin to take our next step, I'm just going to quickly put the tool set in our hand that we're going to use to read the narratives. And one of them is learning to identify seams in the quilt. How the pieces, where are the boundaries of the pieces, how the pieces have been arranged, and how they're put together is a huge study tool for understanding what it means. And a lot of that is noticing boundaries of pieces, so to speak. So we'll see the boundaries of the pieces, and it'll open your question, but I would be fun to teach that class. But it's just got a whole other set of issues going on than what I'm going to at least kind of point us towards.
If I could ask, what do you and your wife do with the quilt? Do you hang it? Do you use it?
Oh, the actual
Do you
quilt?
store it? Yes.
Oh, yeah. We've done, we've never used it.
Okay. So that's
It's been both on our bedroom wall and in storage, back on the wall, and currently in storage.
so that's, I think the extended metaphor really works well with the Bible as well, because for some people, I think the way they approach the quilt is they examine it from afar. Some people just look for the next thing they could use, something to keep themselves warm, something that actually, you know, serves them in that moment and is of comfort. And I know so many people who use the Bible that way. Instead of, you know, sort of taking it apart, disassembling or studying it on a wall, and some people just store it, right? And so I think the, you know, next to meaning and significance, there's also function and utility and what it is for in a very personal way. So I think that could be something that we think about.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful extension of the metaphor that I never thought about.
Yeah. And with use.
Can I quote you on that?
Of course, it's yours.
Here, let's, this is one of, this would be a great way to kind of conclude the session. This is a line from Paul's second letter to Timothy. It's one of my favorite other passages to go to in talking about the function of these texts. This is at the end of 2 Timothy chapter 3. He's writing to his protege. He's been training Timothy to be a leader and a pastor in the church. He ends up being stationed in Ephesus, and he writes to him. And he talks about how from infancy, Timothy has known the holy writings. And again, he's not referring to this. He's referring, so the New Testament doesn't even exist yet. He's writing it, the books that will become it. He's talking about what Christians call the Old Testament. Again, which doesn't exist even in a book. It's in a set of scrolls, and really it's in his mom's heart and mind, and his grandma's heart and mind, who are mentioned elsewhere in the letter. So he was raised on the stories and the poems and the prayers of the Hebrew Bible. And look what he says, therefore. He says they're wisdom literature. They shape your mind and your character. Yeah? What do they give you wisdom about? They give you wisdom to help you understand that you need to be rescued from something. How is it that you are going to be rescued? Well, it's going to be through trust. You rescue from something by trusting in someone. Who is that someone? Well, the Messiah, who the whole Hebrew Bible is about, yeah? And the apostles are convinced that the Messiah that the whole Hebrew Bible is about came among them in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Isn't that great? It's right there. So it's very similar. It is similar. It's the same as Jesus' view of the Scriptures. What are they for? So they're formative literature. They form the identity of communities and of individuals in those communities to shape their character in a certain way. I'm somebody who needs to be rescued from myself and from the powers, according to Paul, and from the way that human nature somehow makes us all love to destroy ourselves and choose it. Self-deception. And if I understand that truth, and if I live in a story that tells that story about humanity, all of a sudden it means the focus of my community is going to be on someone else who can do for us what we can't do for ourselves, namely the anointed representative that is Jesus of Nazareth. There you go. That's what the Bible is for. Right? And then look what it can do. All Scripture is the product of a divine human partnership. It's written by humans who are moved and become like super artists, super literary brilliant artists through the power of the Spirit. And listen, it can tell you stuff you've never heard before, teach you. It can get in your face about the stuff that you say you believe but don't live consistently with, rebuke you. It will point out areas where your thinking is just totally screwed up, correct you. And it will make you into a new kind of human. Form you into a human that does right by God and by your neighbor, so that God's servant can be equipped to go serve the poor. Good works in the New Testament means serving the poor. So there you go. Thank you. Like here's what the Bible is for. So the relevance of the Bible, the significance of it for other topics, is a valid question. But when we're talking about what it means and function and what it is for, here's what we're after. So my goal is we walk away from the Adam and Eve story more devoted to Jesus of Nazareth, the risen Messiah of Israel and Lord of the nations. These stories are meant to help us understand Jesus, who he is, what he did and is doing, and therefore who we are and what we ought to be doing. I think that's what these stories are about, that we're going to look at. The historical questions are very interesting, but it's a different kind of question. So I think we should get a pass to get to go to the front of the line to see the Mona Lisa. Because I think we have a noble effort, a noble task in front of us to actually read these texts on their own terms and in the context of the quilt. So we're going to build up our tool set and march into the opening pages. But first, let's take a break and let our minds get ready to transition.
Okay, what did we hear tonight? What's something that stuck out? And
Play with your mind, cause the question, whatever. I am not afraid of silence. Yes?
You mentioned hermeneutics.
Yep.
For years we've looked at like exegesis and hermeneutics.
Yeah.
We've always studied it that way.
Yeah.
This is what it meant in 1480 or whenever.
Yeah.
And then we get to hermeneutics and we change. Is that detrimental to us understanding the Bible from Genesis to Revelation 21 and 22? Could that cause us an issue because it's all the same story?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
I'm
no.
thinking about this wrong.
Fantastic question. And here's my first answer and thought. I think as I have been on this journey to try to hear, in some ways something new, in some ways it's not something new, because we've talked about it for so long, you know. I think the journey at Arlington began when James Walters came a long time ago and did a weekend on exegesis and hermeneutics and all that, and began that exploration. And for, you know, when I would come back to Arlington, I would hear those kinds of things. I think what Mackie and other people are saying, and I'm discovering lots of other people are saying than I ever imagined before, and is that, yes, do exegesis. He's describing exegesis. We need to listen to these authors. They said something in their day and context. Okay? And even their context has a couple of layers to it. It's the story that happened, and then it's the story of Israel in exile looking back on their story that happened. And so we have the scriptures, the Holy Scriptures that Paul was talking about were put together during what most people think is the exile time, the time they went to Babylon. And here's what I think they're saying to us that's maybe a little different, and maybe I would call it just deeper. He's saying that we need to do the exegesis of Genesis 1 to Revelation 22. We've kind of looked at, hey, let's look at the exegesis of Philippians 1 and 2. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the process. But what we haven't done is step back and looked at this entire story that's for the whole world. And when we say the whole world, it's not just the people that are alive today, it's the people that were alive 200 years ago and 2,000 years ago. God is for them and loves them, you know, just as much as he loves us. And so the exegesis begins with, and I've discovered this, that doing more exegesis on Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, the entire story, has helped me sharpen and focus the exegesis that I do on Philippians 1. It's put it even more context. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. He said it's a clunky word. It's not a fun word because, when you're in a seminary class, as soon as they say hermeneutics, you go, bleh, you know. But exegesis means that you look at it in its context. That you first look at it in its context. That, it's kind of like listening to a phone conversation. I taught a class in Ghana, and I did it on purpose because the Ghanaians would just be rolling on the floor laughing. Because I would ask somebody to call my phone in class when I was teaching. And I would say, call at a certain time, and I would pick up the phone, and I would go, hello? Debbie, Ochina. No, Ochina. And I would hang up. And they would just laugh that I was talking on the phone in in their language, you know. And what I was saying was, no, I'm coming tomorrow. And then I would hang up, and I would ask them, what did the person on the other end of the line say? And they said, they thought you were coming today, you know. And you're not there, and they're wondering where you are. You know, I said, you figured it all out. You figured out the whole conversation. That's what we're doing when we come to the Bible. We're listening to Paul talk to churches, and we can, when he says things like, man, you got to get along. What's the other line? What's on the other line? People aren't getting along very well. People are having trouble getting along with each other. So that's exegesis, looking at it in its context. Hermeneutics, he said, originally meant translate. It's come to mean interpret. So how does that apply to us today? So if a passage that I've always gone to is, when I'm taught biblical interpretation, is this. I sometimes will go to 1 Corinthians 8, and I'll read the first verse. Well, first I'll say, does the whole Bible apply to us? Yes, the whole Bible applies to us. 1 Corinthians 8. Now about food sacrificed to idols. Does the whole Bible apply to us? Anybody struggling in here with food sacrificed to idols? We're having a problem? And so that's an illustration of we need to do the exegesis. What does Paul say to a group of people who are struggling with, do I eat meat sacrificed in an idol temple? Do we ignore it today? Or is there something that we can take and learn from? Can we think about perhaps a situation today that's like that? Or is there a principle? And the principle Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 8 is love the other person more than you have your own rights. That's what basically Paul says in a very simple way, in a very generalized summary way. He says, don't just be looking out for your own. Somebody has a problem with food sacrificed to idols and they come over to your house. Don't put it on the table just to make them mad and upset, just to see if you can get a rise out of them. That we're here to love. And then he also says in that passage, we all know that idols are nothing. We all know that really and truly, but for some people, he says, it's a problem. They grew up in those idol temples. And this doesn't feel right. This feels like my old life. This feels like, and remember, we have to remember that at the table they're sitting at with Christians, they're taking the Lord's Supper too. And some people may just, it just doesn't sit right with me. Does that make sense? So exegesis is reading it in their context, which that's basically what he's calling for, but he's doing it in a deeper way. And then we have to say, we got to apply it to ourselves. And he kind of said that too, because he said, we all the time, we try to take, for some reason, we take this Genesis 2-5 piece of the quilt that's here, if this is it right here. And we try to stick it on the quilt of, where did humans come from? Or LGBTQ, And we just have to be real careful before we stick it on there to hear what it says where it fits in the bigger quilt. Let's hear that first, before we go making statements like, God didn't make Adam and Steve, he made Adam and Eve, okay? We need to see what these writers were saying about humanity and sexuality and these kinds of things, and then let the Spirit help us discern. How do we do that, and what do we do with that today? Because I promise you, the writer who wrote Genesis 2-5 was not thinking about LGBTQ issues. He was not. Didn't factor in. Doesn't mean there weren't homosexual people when he was writing. Okay, Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? But he was not saying, man, we need to write a tract on LGBT. That's not what he's doing at all. And so we have to be kind of careful and discerning there to do that. Human origins, original sin, all those things. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I was just thinking about hermeneutics as well. We, in our restoration movement, had a hermeneutic.
Right.
Man, example, inference, necessary inference. But it was just making me think how dangerous to pick a hermeneutic
Right.
and write that all the way ahead.
Yeah.
This is the, what do you think this is the one?
Yeah.
It's a group of people who decide.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've got other hermeneutics the way, and I just think, wow, you got to really be careful.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been learning in the last couple months of preparing to go to Memphis next week, is that we have to be a lot more discerning about everything is God's and not ours. And the Spirit leads in more ways than sometimes we let him lead, you know. So we use the language of the Spirit more than we actually let the Spirit do everything. It's a habit. I don't mean we're evil, terrible, bad people. We're broken people, and our discernment needs to grow. Well, I'll tell you what it's caused in me is I just want to shut up. You know, I just feel like just shut up. You've got too much to learn to open your mouth again. You know. And that's not a completely good thing to do either. As you learn, it's okay to speak up and say, this, you know, right now, this is, I mean, and that reflects what Mark's doing every week in the Psalms. When I got up 2 weeks ago and preached the Psalms, I was trying to reflect, you know, when I see this right now, this is what I see. This is what I see when I see this. It doesn't mean it's all right. It doesn't mean it's all it's completed or finished or anything like that. But here it is, and so it's a process. And what Mackie said here at the end, before we talk about the verse, I thought that was the most beautiful exposition of that verse I've ever heard in my life. It was unbelievably beautiful. But he said, what we're about to do is take that piece from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible. That's Genesis 2 through 5, and we're going to kind of, in a sense, cut it out. We're not going to forget that it's a part of lots of other things, and we're going to keep, and he says, I'm going to keep going back to that. But we're going to kind of pull this apart a little bit and look at these pieces in Genesis 2 through 5 without trying to think in our minds about gender identity or any of these kinds of things, you know. Let's just do this first. Just have the discipline and patience to do this and hear this. And that's what he's about to do. And it's kind of breathtaking. It really is what he's about to do. But he's laid a really good, solid foundation in saying, let's think about these questions as we do this, you know. What else did you hear real quick? And then we'll talk about 2 Timothy 3. Remember, Jesus said, what he was meaning by, I want to read the Bible that Jesus read, like he did. Remember in Luke 24, Jesus told the disciples who, they had their heads down on Sunday morning after the cross, and they were leaving Jerusalem and walking to Emmaus, and this guy walks up and said, what are y'all talking about? You know, and they kind of went, geez, you know. And it was Jesus, and they said, you haven't heard? And he was like, no, tell me. What's going on? What happened? They go, are you serious? You haven't heard what happened this weekend? We thought this guy was the Messiah, and he's dead, and he's not. And Jesus kept walking. Oh, man, that sounds terrible. It sounds awful. And Jesus then began to say, let's open your Bibles. Let's start back in Genesis 1. Now, he didn't have a Bible, you know. Let's start back in Genesis 1. And he's told those guys that this story from Genesis to Malachi was about him. It's about me. Everything's about me. And it had to happen. This is where the story led to. And today there's a new world. The whole story climaxed to this weekend. And today there's a brand new world. A brand new world's been created. And you're now a part of it. And then he sat down to eat with them. And I think, my personal opinion, it's not in there, is it says Jesus handed them the bread and they recognized him. I think when he handed them the bread, what did they see? They saw the nail prints in his hand. And they were completely blown away, you know. And so Paul says, this is how Paul says that. In 2 Timothy, when he's teaching his protege, when he's doing leadership development for Timothy, he says, you've heard this from when you were young, and these scriptures, you do not lose sight of these scriptures in this story, because these scriptures are for the purpose of leading you to rescue by putting your faith, trust in the Messiah, Jesus. The Messiah is the general term. Jesus, human term, you know. Okay. And then he said they're useful. These scriptures, Genesis to Malachi, were breathed on by God. And he wants you, when he says breathed on by God, to close your eyes and picture God over this lump of clay in the Garden of Eden, or before the Garden of Eden, and going, and Adam sits up, wakes up, and he's a human person. He wants you to see that this story is like that. This story is brought to life by the breath of God. And it's it'll help you, like he said, it'll help you learn things you've never learned. It'll jump up in your face and slap you, It'll say, nope, that's the wrong way. This is the right way, and it will train you to do good works. He says, serve the poor. So, yeah, I mean, that's what we're about to dive into, is the introduction to that story. We're about to dive into 4 chapters, sorry, I can count. 4 chapters that are the introduction to that quilt, to that big quilt. And we've shown here a couple of times those pictures, these pictures, this quilt actually, when you get it up on the wall and look at it, it's like one of those composite pictures, and Jesus appears. It's got a lot of little pictures, and Paul and Jesus. Oh, that's Jesus, And one of the composite pictures is Genesis 2. Man, I thought that girl made an incredible point when she asked Tim, "What do you and your wife do with your special quilt?" And that was such an incredible metaphor. Some people put it in storage. It's just, we keep it in storage. We want people to know it's in there, and we have one, and it's really cool. It's a really cool old thing, but it stays in there. Do you get it out and tell people the story about every piece? Like if I had a quilt, I would love to show you a piece of my grandfather's, my dad's Army uniform, and all that meant with him dying and my father growing up without a father, and the effect that it had on him, and that whole story that grows from that piece of cloth. Or some people I just like it to keep me warm. I don't really pay attention to what it looks like. I just need warmth. And so, yeah, beautiful, beautiful extension of the metaphor. Mark, were you about to say something?
When you're talking about the Emmaus Road, John 20, Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
Jesus appears to her, turns around, he asks her, "Why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" That's another one of those moments.
Yeah.
He knew why she was crying. He knew who she was looking for him. But he's different. He's changed. And what she's looking for is different.
Yes.
Who he is. So he's challenging her. Who is he looking for? Then he calls her Mary. And she realizes. And then she says something incredible. She calls him in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. Of everything else she could have called him, why is she calling him teacher? It's almost like we're getting this glimpse into her heart of, you're going to have to teach me all the way.
Yeah.
Because this is right. You are not who I thought
I do
you
not
were.
feel at home in this new world
This is
yet.
the quilt. Catch who I thought you were.
Yeah.
And it's not.
Yeah. It's almost like, and she didn't fully grasp it, but tell me if I just completely messed up what you're saying, because it's beautiful. It's almost like I was looking at this, all I could see was this little piece, and all of a sudden you're standing here and there's just big giant, I only thought there was one little piece, and now there's this big giant. And her heart said, teach. That's, I love that. That's so beautiful. The significance of that story is, yeah. I have been playing in my mind, I just want to share with y'all, in my mind for probably over a year now. And maybe, yeah, Mark, maybe the elders, maybe we do this sometime, but a weekend or a series, whatever, of maybe call it the Emmaus Road, but the resurrection encounter stories. Let's just go deep into those encounters with Jesus, the resurrected Christ, the reactions to the resurrected Christ. And because we live in a world that's ruled by the resurrected Christ, you know. And are those our instincts? Are those our, you know, I don't know. I'm just played around like calling it the road to Emmaus. You know, I've heard that before, but you know, where is he is another, you know, might be, you know, where have they taken him? You know, nowhere. He's right here. But anyway, yeah. Yeah, anything else from these? I promise, the introduction's over. I promise. But I think he's laid such a beautiful framework and put some pictures and metaphors in our mind that can now allow us to, with excitement, let's go get this piece and let's look at it and let's look at Genesis 2 through 5. Let's have the love for the ancient authors to listen to them without saying, but you don't live in 2023, but but what about this and what about this and what about this? Let's just close our mouths and close our perceptions and these things, and let's let them talk. You know, let's let them tell their story as they're telling their story. And he's going to do a really good job of letting them tell their story and also making us aware of the story that they're in, where they're living, and why they use this language and why they told it this way. And I guess the only other thing I would say is let's kind of suspend, as we do this, our instinct that everything has to be completely literal or not. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? There are some people who can't have faith in God unless this is a literal story. Unless it is. Okay? And so let's first of all, let's set that and listen to them. Maybe it is. Maybe it is a literal story, told in a little different way than we would tell it. And maybe what we mean by literal is something different than what ancient people thought. Can I say that? I know this is 1 or 2 minutes over, but I wrote it down to say it, and I want to say it. Once again, I said it 2 weeks ago. Why did God do it this way? Why not give us an updated Bible like every 100 years? Okay, now America's come into being. Let's update the Bible, because now America has come into being. And so we need to have a Bible that reflects, now there's a new country that has said to kings, which no other country in the history of the world has ever said, hey, king, on you. Okay? And so now we need a new Bible, right? We need a new word from God. You know? Huh?
Just because our story changes doesn't mean his does.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's a beautiful answer. Yeah, it's a great answer. Yeah. He wants us to not think we're too big for our britches. That his creation has something to teach us. And by his creation includes 3,000 years ago, right? That includes his creation. That includes his love for his creation. That includes his mission. And I think that what he wants us to do is not look at those people those people are so stupid. They didn't have cars or electricity or anything. They're so ignorant. No. That they wrote from where they lived and what they knew. They worshiped God from where they knew. And I think he wants us to just have a little humility in his creation. That we're not some special people that, you know, just came on the scene and now we've solved everything because we came on the scene, you know.
I just love that It was so really nice.
Yeah.
It's really special. But to be able to see Jesus, because I wasn't taught that Jesus was in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I was taught that, you know, there was a Messiah, Messiah coming.
Yeah.
But I wasn't taught that. And so now it's like there's color.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it's coming to life. And I've heard myself in teaching classes, okay, you know, this is the Bible, and you know, there's two parts, and the Old Testament is supposed to be about God, and the New Testament is about Jesus.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
that's not right.
Yeah.
And
And,
I'm like,
and God got over his bad mood, and now we're okay.
it's like I've been seeing in black and white, and now it's like, it's kind of adjusting.
Yeah.
The colors are coming in.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome.
It just shows how hard it is in life for us to do this.
Yeah.
You know, think about the deists, Thomas Jefferson. They all couldn't be rational people. They couldn't, they thought miracles were ridiculous. So they took miracles out of the Jesus stories. The audacity.
Yeah.
They were like, but that's what we do because we need to update
Yeah.
the hard times. And then you get the Jesus seminar. Back in the 70s, wasn't it?
Yeah. 70s.
These Bible scholars
Man.
sat around the table and decided which words of Jesus he really said. And they voted. And they removed about 75% of the words because they just couldn't accept them.
Yeah.
You know, just like, what?
All kinds of ways we try to rationalize. Yeah. Yeah.
We have to be careful.
Yes. We sit here and go, man, I can't believe those people do that. Well, do we like it when Jesus says stuff like sell everything and give it to the poor, or oh, well, he didn't mean that, you know, or, you know, narrow is the way, or anything like that. I want to grapple with every one of those texts. Even if, because, and listen to what Mark's doing for us on Sunday mornings. He's letting us hear the people of God's worship manual, and it's full of people grappling with, it's okay to grapple and wrestle. And I mean, yeah, you might even come out of wrestling with God, if there was ever such a story, limping with a new name, you know, that means Israel, you know, yeah, man. And I think what Mackie's saying is let's wrestle with all that. Let's wrestle, and what we'll find is so many more better answers to human origins, and how do we interact with and love LGBTQ people instead of being the ones who stand there like this all the time and being the reputation of being, you know, I want that community to go, I am completely shocked at who you are. I am completely shocked. Now, that doesn't mean I have to say, there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. Just, you know, God loves love. Love is not love. And that LGBTQ person would tell me love is not love. When I said, well, I fell in love with a 13-year-old girl, and I want to marry her, they would say love is not love. Right? So love is not love. It's just, where do we set the boundaries? And there's someone who has, but there's ways to say that and there's ways to do that. There's ways, you know. But I think the more we listen to the text, the more we'll have an understanding and a way to interact and to love people radically, like Jesus said to do. Even our enemies, So man, I'm going to try my best next week to be online with you. I may be so tired and brain dead, and I may be reading another book, I don't know. But I'm going to try my best. I can't wait for it to actually dive in and start. So, yeah. Everybody just going to have to live with 10 less minutes of your time, of your evening. So, all right. Everybody have a great week.